Morning again, ladies and gentlemen. The U.S. Naval Institute welcomes you to Defense Forum Washington 2012's opening panel, Fearing the Fiscal Cliff, What are the Implications for Industry? At the outset, let me say that when we get to the Q&A session, we'll have one mic for this panel, and so if you don't have a mic available to you, please offer your question loudly. Thank you. We welcome our panelists, and we are privileged and honored to have Dr. Nora Bensahel, a leading scholar in the field, as panel moderator. Dr. Bensahel is Deputy Director of Studies and Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security. And she is an adjunct associate professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Dr. Bensahel is a magna cum laude graduate of Cornell University and received her PhD and MA degrees from the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. She has served as a research assistant to former Secretary of Defense William J. Perry. Dr. Bensahel is a widely published author of books and articles on defense, international strategy, and national security. She is a recent co-author of Hard Choices, Responsible Defense in an Age of Austerity, and Sustainable Preeminence, Reforming the U.S. Military at a Time of Strategic Change. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Bensahel.
Thank you very much for that. Is that on now? Yes, it is. Great. Thank you. Thank you again for that kind introduction. Before I introduce the panel, which is, as you know, from the program on the fiscal cliff and its implications for industry, I thought I would just take the privilege of the moderator and just talk for a couple of minutes about the fiscal cliff to set the tone. Because we didn't talk about the specifics of that so much in the keynote this morning, and I think it'll set the debate, the context for the rest of the forum here today. People who focus on defense tend to focus primarily on sequestration, and of course questions this morning reflected that. But sequestration is only one piece of the fiscal cliff, as I'm sure you all know from reading the newspapers. And sequestration's fate is not going to be judged based on its merits. It's not going to be judged based on its effect on the Department of Defense or how we would like defense spending to go. It is actually only a very small percentage of the total dollars at stake in the overall fiscal cliff, and that's the balance between revenue and spending that, of course, Congress is debating at the moment. If you look at the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, the expiration of the payroll tax cuts, a bunch of other things that are all on the fiscal cliff, and you take sequestration as a percentage of the overall dollars, defense sequestration is about 11% of the total. And what that means is that given the incredible political divides that we all know about from reading the newspapers in the morning, something that's worth 11% of that total isn't going to be a particularly high priority in the negotiations. And in fact, it's likely to be a bargaining chip to the extent that it matters at all in these broader debates, that you trade off for something else. That's not something that people who do defense for a living necessarily know about or like to think about. But that, unfortunately, is the political reality that we're in. And at the moment, the prospects for a grand bargain do not look good. And again, you just read the newspapers every day and you see how little progress seems to be being made substantively. The focus, of course, for the defense community is on sequestration, and the sequestration mechanism, as I'm sure you all know, not only involves $1 trillion of cuts over the next 10 years, but also implements them in a particular way that for fiscal 13 would require equal cuts to every program, plan, and activity. It's possible that that mechanism may go away, but I would put forth, perhaps somewhat controversially in this audience, that when you take the total dollars that are going to be cut from the Defense Department in the coming downturn, because we are about to go through a drawdown, whether it is the sequestration mechanism or not, if you project a few years and whatever the floor is, I don't know exactly when that will hit, but the cuts are going to be going well beyond fiscal 13 and 14. Whatever that ultimate floor is, I would hazard a guess that no matter what happens in the next few weeks with sequestration, you're likely to see at least sequestration level amounts and possibly even greater before the tide turns and defense spending increases once again. That obviously has great implications, both for the U.S. military, and that'll be the focus of the next panel, but for the defense industry as well, and that's what this panel is going to focus on here today. I'm going to introduce the panelists all together at once. I'm going to shorten it because we could be here for the entire hour talking about everybody's full bios, but I think you have them in your packets. We'll start and we'll go down in this order. We'll start with Dr. Gordon Adams, who will talk about some of the choices and paths that could possibly unfold in the coming weeks and months. He is a professor at the School of International Service at American University and is the former Associate Director for National Security and International Affairs at the Office of Management and Budget. Next will be Jim McAleese on how the Pentagon is viewing developments. He is a principal at McAleese & Associates, a government contracts consulting and legal firm. And then wrapping up before we get to your questions and answers will be Bobby Sturgill on how industry is planning under the current uncertainty. And he is the Senior Vice President of Washington Operations at Rockwell Collins. So, Gordon, over to you.
I'm going to stand up and go over here on the assumption that this mic is live because I think better on my feet. Not well, just better. All right. Thank you very much, Nora. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you all for being here. It's still kind of early. And you're dealing with a subject that, needless to say, is not in the least at the center of attention in Washington, D.C. I should say, you know, as Nora pointed out in my bio, I'm from OMB, so you know I'm here to help you. Why does that always get a laugh? I don't quite understand why that always gets a laugh. But anyway, let me underline something to start that Nora said because I fully agree with it. And that is that we are in a drawdown. Now, I started saying this about 2 years ago and nobody believed it, but by now I don't think there's anybody virtually in the room who doesn't believe that we're in a drawdown. And we're in a drawdown not particularly because of the fiscal cliff. We're in the drawdown because Iraq is gone from our books and the soldiers are gone from Iraq, because the soldiers are coming out of Afghanistan. The consequence of that is attention shifts away from issues of war and peace and troops deployed forward in the field, and it shifts to issues that we know fully well, which are jobs and the economy and debt and the deficit. Those are now the centerpiece of political attention. It's really important to understand that because what has happened for those of us who spend most of our lives in the defense world, the context is everything. The context has changed. And when that context changes, defense becomes, as it is, for example, in the negotiations over the fiscal cliff, a residual. It's something that gets dealt with as you move along the path, not something that is the center of attention. How do we know that we're at that point? You know, in my own life, yesterday I went to a Fix the Debt conference here in Washington, D.C., which was entirely devoted to two subjects, healthcare and taxes. Not either one subjects that I'm particularly deep in expertise in, but I figured I better know more about it because that's what the negotiation's about. It's not about defense. You saw this over the, what I like to call shadow play of sequester over the last 16 months or so, because all of the efforts made to isolate defense, protect defense, make defense the issue politically, whatever, failed. They failed completely because we are outside that context. That context is not driving the traffic, right? So when Senators McCain and Graham and Ayotte went on a tour to bases and plants in the districts, I went back and looked at how the president and the Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, did in those states, and I think in all but one of those states the president carried the state, which meant the resonance was nowhere. Even at the local level, the resonance did not seem to be apparent in the political outcome. It was a political argument, and it's going to be a political argument now. The characteristic of that kind of argument, and we've been there before, is everything has to be on the table. I repeat, everything has to be on the table. And it has to be on the table because you cannot get to the goal budgetarily unless you take a little bit from everywhere. And you cannot get to the goal politically unless everything is on the table because everybody has a stake in all the equities that are at stake in the federal fisc, revenues and spending alike. So in that context, which is critical, defense is a residual. And there is, I think, growing recognition now that we are in a drawdown, whether that context overwhelms us in the next few weeks or not. I took a look a few weeks ago. There's a series of reports. They go back to reports, including one that Nora had a very important hand in that was mentioned in her introduction, but Center for American Progress, Project for Defense Alternatives, the Stimson Center, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and most recently the RAND Corporation. Wherever you go on the spectrum of views about defense, virtually everybody now says, how do we start thinking about a long-term drawdown? And as I said, it's not the first time we've done a long-term drawdown. We did it after the Second World War, we did it after Korea, we did it after Vietnam, we did it at the end of the Cold War. I am old enough to have lived through all of those. Now, admittedly, after the Second World War, I was pretty young, but I have actually lived through all those drawdowns and was in the Office of Management and Budget for 5 years during the last one. So I can tell you this is a known commodity to all of us. This is not new, it's not a surprise. It is something that happens, one could almost say, with a 20-year regularity in American history. And every one of those instances in some way takes the issue of defense out of its own individual context and puts it in that larger budgetary and international security context. And that's how the decisions get made. The details are then over to the Defense Department and the planners. What does this look like when we go into one of these drawdowns? Well, if you look at it historically, the pattern's fairly clear. In almost every one of the drawdowns that we've done, the deepest cuts happen on the acquisition side of the budget. Every single time. Those are relatively easy dollars to get a hold of, they're relatively easy dollars to cut, and those are the dollars that are already being touched. Right, they're already being touched as we look at it now. It may come as news to you that we've already started this drawdown. The fiscal 11 budget was lower than the fiscal 10 budget, the 12 budget's lower than the 11 budget, factoring in inflation. And the 13 budget will be lower than the 12 budget, you can be guaranteed. So we're already in this drawdown. That said, we haven't cut the budget yet. Now, why do I say that? Of course we've cut the budget. Yes, those 3 years we definitely did, but for somebody who has a green eye shade and a propeller hat like me, you don't really call a cut until it's below the rate of inflation or nominally below the prior year. That's a cut. That's for real, and that's what we did in 11, that's what we did in 12, and that's what we're going to do in 13. The line that currently projects the defense budget over the next 10 years is not a cut. It basically keeps flat with inflation. I believe, and I heard Nora say it too, and I think most of the consensus now is it will go down really from that level. That is the best that one can expect. Procurement, deepest cuts. People, next. Size of the end strength goes down. And it's done it in every bill down. It will do it predictably in this one as well. Operations and maintenance cuts, somewhat more shallow. A very hard budget category to get your arms around. I'll say something about that again in a moment. Research and development tends to be the most shallow. So if you're in the R&D business or you have an R&D business at the end of your business, that's the area where opportunities continue to exist in a drawdown. Will it look like that this time? Yes, I think it will. It's already starting to look like that. Procurement is already down more sharply than spending in the other titles of the defense budget. And we will predictably do that in major defense acquisition programs by stretching and reducing the buy of major systems, and by taking a fairly heavy hammer to other procurement. That's the typical pattern. So the people in the truck business or the ammo business or the front-end loader business will find that part of procurement goes down even sharper than major defense programs, which typically are not eliminated, but are stretched and the buy is reduced. In the R&D areas I suggested, I think it will probably be relatively flat. That's your seed corn, and departments over history seem to suggest they know that's the seed corn. That's where you invest. We did in the 90s. We did in previous bill downs. Operations and maintenance spending will be cut, probably not enough. I'll say something about that in a minute. But in my judgment, the areas that are most likely to be affected are in services contracting, which is already coming down because of the end of the war in Iraq and the coming end of the conflict in Afghanistan, and probably with respect to downsizing of civilians in the Department of Defense. I won't ask people to raise their hands if they're civilians in the Department of Defense. I don't want to worry you. But it looks possible, and in the last bill down we did. In the last bill down we took 700,000 people out of the active duty force structure, 300,000 people out of the civilians in the Pentagon, about a 30% in both cases. And that's the typical pattern. Every historical bill down that we've done, year 1 peak to year 10 base, has gone down 30% in constant dollars. That's the pattern, and they cluster very nicely. It's not a random scatter diagram. So if that's what it's going to look like, what should it look like? I'm one of those people, this may not be welcome either, but I'd like to at least argue that it's worth thinking about how we do less with less. Not more with less, but less with less. What does that mean strategically? I'm not going to go into all of the details of that, but it means setting some strategic priorities, and the RAND report from a couple of weeks ago, actually about a month ago, actually does say, if you're going to make this kind of choice, here's what you need to look at. Here's a Westpac focus. Here's a stabilization focus. Here's ways you can look at this and say, here are the choices and the greater risks and the lesser risks that would be accepted strategically. There are three other areas where I think it needs to focus, and these are tough. These are really tough. I like to say we spend too much on defense, and we do spend too much on defense. A lot of what we spend too much on is stuff that has only an indirect relationship to military capability. But it is a persistent inability to hold down the costs of acquisition programs that is only 60 or 70 years long. That's not an accusation aimed at any administration or party. It's a reality historically. We have not found yet the magic talisman for holding down costs. So acquisition, pricing is one area. The second is discipline in the operations and maintenance area. We could go into that in detail in discussion, but getting one's arms around why O&M continues to go up at a rate of about 2 to 2.5% per year per troop, regardless of where you're going with the budget, regardless of what the threat is, regardless of the exercise, is a problem no Secretary of Defense has gotten his arms around. And finally, and this is going to ruffle feathers, I'm sure, but we have a relatively expensive compensation, benefits, and especially healthcare system in the Department of Defense today. And looking at how we normalize that and keep that under control, our personnel costs have soared over the past decade, last 10 or 15 years, soared well over the $100,000 per troop mark. And getting inside that and saying, how do we keep that under control is a question. Now, let me close by just saying something about the cliff, having avoided it this entire talk, and I gather Bill managed to successfully avoid it in his opening talk this morning. Two things. One, I predict we won't go over it, but we'll have one hell of a lot of fun watching the drama. An awful lot of fun. The reporters are going absolutely crazy right now because every day they have to find a new angle, and every day somebody has to get a new story, and every day somebody has to put out an announcement, and it's one wonderful public negotiating stance after another. Getting together behind closed doors seems to be a little bit more difficult. I don't think we're going to go over it because the embarrassment factor is too great, and frankly, right now, politically, I think the White House holds the whip hand. In terms of concessions, it's going to have to come from the Republicans on the Hill, in my judgment. I like to call it a pothole, too. Let's assume the worst. We go over the cliff. This is, down we go. I have been watching people tear their hair and render their garments and gnash their teeth for the last 16 months, but quite frankly, I do see in the last month or two a beginning of realism about what this might actually mean for defense. We can talk about it, but milpers are exempted. So anybody in uniform with benefits is exempted from any impact of the fiscal cliff. Second off, for the industry, some wise and cooler heads in industry have finally begun to prevail and say, look, I'm working on contracts on obligated dollars. Those contracts are not impacted by a fiscal cliff. The thing I have to look at is the future of my company in terms of the loss of resources in the future and what that might mean for the contracts that I have. I had a conversation after a talk I gave to a bunch of Pentagon program managers about a month and a half ago. Afterwards, one of them came up to me and said, so, okay, fiscal cliff. You're telling me I, as a program manager, it was Air Force in this case, I, as a program manager, will have 9.2% fewer resources for my program than I did when I put it in my budget back when we developed a budget and sent it up to the Hill. Is that right? Yes, that's right. I can do that, he said. That's what they pay me to do. I do that all the time. Inside my program, I figure out with reserve funds and some slush how I can move the pieces around so I live with 9% fewer dollars than I had before. Not pretty, but not impossible. So even in the program area for the Pentagon, for the industry, it's a pothole more than it is a cliff. In the O&M area, interesting technicality about the way O&M is going to define program, project, and activity, which is the language in the Budget Control Act. In the O&M area, apparently OMB and DOD agree, and Ash Carter testified to this last summer, that O&M is going to be called, PPA is going to be called an account. Right? Well, an account's nice, because an account's Army O&M, Marine Corps O&M, Navy O&M. You have an intense flexibility inside what is, after all, a third of the budget, to reallocate and move dollars around inside the O&M categories to cope with a 9.2% loss of resources. Right? What do I think those movements around will be? Well, if I were a comptroller and I were in the building, I'd be protecting the forward deployed folks who are actively in combat in Afghanistan or elsewhere. I'd be protecting important training and important exercising, fuel acquisition, things of that kind. I'd be looking seriously at real property maintenance. I'd be seriously looking at who's got the contracts for cutting the lawn at Fort Belvoir. I'd make choices, and I'd set priorities. In an odd kind of way, from my point of view, because I see O&M as one of the least disciplined parts of defense spending. Remember, you're talking to a budget propeller head guy here. I see that as actually an interesting form of discipline in operations and maintenance. And I'll tell you why, because I saw it happen in the 90s when I was at OMB. When the O&M dollars went down, better choices got made. And those better choices paid off, because you ended up with reasonably good combat capability and a skinny down operations infrastructure, back office, overhead at the department. Wouldn't be entirely a bad thing. Not the best way to plan it, but not a bad thing. As I said, uniforms okay in sequester. And last closing thought, one of the things that I think, and we can talk more about the technicalities of this if you want, one of the things that I think is likely to happen if we do go over the cliff or into the pothole is a use by the Office of Management and Budget of what's called the apportionment authority, which basically allows operations of management and budget to say, keep spending at the level of the CR, which is what is in law right now, keep spending at that level, and allow the political process to figure out what it's going to do about this. In other words, you don't go off the cliff right away. You go off the cliff eventually. There's a certain risk in the roll of the dice in saying that, because you end up with 2 quarters worth of spending you got to take your hit on if you have to, instead of 3 quarters worth of spending. But the bet may be worth it, and I would expect that's what OMB will do. I can't tell you that's what they will do. I do not know that. But if I were sitting at OMB, it's what I would have on the table as an option. Thank you.
Good morning. That sounded terrible. I'll do it one more time. Good morning. Good morning. All right, you guys are awake. Let me be really brief. I like to wander, if that's okay. Rare opportunity to be here this morning. Literally in an hour, I get to spend meet with most of the Navy this morning. Hang out with Secretary Lynn, hiding in the back of the room. Hang out with CNAS. Headed Gordon Adams. Hang out with Top Gun's Bobby Sturgill. Most of the House Armed Services Committee. Hang out with Romney's Senior National Security Advisor Lehman. Doing a lot more listening this morning than I will be talking. Q&A will be critical from my perspective. Show of hands, since we didn't do this this morning. How many of you guys, is this being taped?
How many of you guys really believe that we're going to go over the cliff? Okay, mental note, the Navy doesn't believe this at the front row. All right, let's say it again. Okay, maybe 25%, a third? How many of us believe that we will not go over the cliff? Okay. How many didn't vote? And I think he voted twice, just so you know. Okay. I share the sentiment of the second group. I'm confident that we're going to have a deal. I agree with Nora's position. 2013 will be the first of cuts. We're about $150 billion in our base budget above where we have historically been in past troughs. I agree with Gordon's concerns about O&M procurement, and Bill Lynn's issue on procurement will get hit first. Thoughts? Let me give you a little perspective on OSD, then and now. Services, right? Tiny bit on CEOs, because Bobby's going to hit that, and a little bit on the shareholders, okay, because I think they're all going to fit together. 6 months ago, if Secretary Panetta were here, and if he was here, I'd be sitting listening. I wouldn't be lecturing him. But he would have said probably 3 things about sequester. What would they have been? Catastrophic, irreparable harm, and irresponsible. Now, Secretary briefed at NORA's platform 2 weeks ago. What did he say? Get me a deal. I'll take whatever you got. Give me certainty. And I'm paraphrasing. I defer to you. He was your guest. He didn't show up at my house afterwards. I was disturbed. I'm joking. I'm sorry. Get me a deal, right? Get the shadow off my department, number one, right? What else did he say? Tell Congress to get me a defense authorization bill. I need that for my multi-years, and I need that to avoid shutting down my operations, force structure, so on and so forth, Afghanistan, right? What else did he say? Lynn talked about this morning. Give me a cyber bill. Totally unexpected. We never would have expected to hear that 6 months ago, correct? And the last thing was, get Dunford confirmed. Huge change. Would you agree? 6 months. Okay, services. Would everybody agree with me that services have been extraordinarily silent for 6 months? If anybody disagrees, raise your hand. You guys can't vote. You're with Joe's staff. That doesn't count. Okay, why? Why have the services not been planning for sequester? The moment the services, yes, sir, go ahead. You're spot on. The moment you plan for sequester, the current POMs, to the best of my understanding, are based upon 2014 to 2018, is based upon the top-line budget authority from the 13 to 17 FIDEP. Sound about right? Right? So let's assume you plan for sequester, but we think it's just a 2013 sequester, correct? That's how we think. Building doesn't see that. The building says, oh my God, the moment McAleese reduces my top-line authority by $55 billion in 2013, it cascades through 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18. I do the math, that's about a $300 billion hit that's happening instantaneously. Army guys, who's here? Oh God, sir, this is a poor showing. All right, I got to talk to McHugh about this. All right, what does that do for General Odierno? Right, let's assume of a $55 billion cut going forward, right? His part of the bill is probably 12 to 14 billion, yes? Fewer BCTs, ground combat vehicle, ooh. JLTV, new helicopter programs, and the network, correct? Odierno's biggest priority. Am I right? Okay. Let's talk Navy, right? The Commandant would go insane. Instantaneously, USMC procurement, what happens? Amphib combat vehicle, gone. MPC, probably gone. JLTV, gone. Right? Shipbuilders, who's in ships? I'll come stand next to you guys. Okay. Inside the SCN account, what happens? Amphibs? Ooh, bad sign, right? Littoral combat ship, gotta have it. But maybe not at the rates per year, even if the total fleet's gonna be the same size. Right? Who's CVN 79, right? Big funding years are 2015 to 2017, even though the initial order year is 2013, correct? Secondary impacts to Virginia class, secondary impacts DDG 51, and the giant elephant in the room that no one's mentioned yet is production date for SSBNX. And that's just Admiral Greener's ships, right? What's it do to his aircraft portfolio? Who's aircraft? All right, let the record show that the aircraft guys didn't show today. Ah, there he is, all right. All right, it shuts down his option on what? Potential extension of Super Hornet, right? Potential extension of Growler. Puts more pressure on the CVs and Stovals, doesn't it? Threatens the ability to order the P-8 ASWs and the V-22s at the rates he needs, and it threatens the game-changing future of UAS in terms of both BAMs and U-class, doesn't it? Air Force. Who's here from Air Force? Good morning, sir. I think you're in rare company here today. There's nobody else? All right, we'll have to scrub that off the video. There was a much larger Air Force group than I remember, sir. What's that mean for aircraft programs for General Welsh? Tanker. Mobility, really important, right? When did she go into production? 2015. Correct? What's the next problem? CTOL, F-35. When did she go into production surge? 2015. Correct? What's the next problem? Long-range strike bomber. She's in development. RDT&E money. Gordon's right. Correct? But those are some big dollars come 2016, 2017, aren't they? And then you've got specialty aircraft, combat rescue helicopter, right? And we almost entirely forgot about the TXX trainer, didn't we? The moment that the services begin to plan for sequester, that $12 to $14 billion bill per year per service, that $300 billion total over the FIDEP, immediately hits the services. And so I can understand why the department is doing what it's doing. CEOs. Any CEOs here today? They're all smart enough not to raise their hand. Oh, Admiral Daly, I see you in the back, sir. I count you with the Navy, sir. Don't try to vote twice. Okay, so CEOs. 6 months ago, what were we saying? Millions of job losses. How many hundreds of thousand WARN Act issue notices are going out to the full workforce the week before the election, correct? The election's what, 30 days old? What happened? Did I miss the WARN Act notices? They didn't come, did they? Right? In fact, what you fundamentally see is the CEOs, I don't want to get ahead of Bobby, they are fundamentally seeking to differentiate themselves from one another by talking about the international orders, sequester proof, right? And also the big backlog. Did it strike anybody as odd that the F-35 LRIP 5 contract got signed on Friday? That's $4 billion of unobligated money that Gordon England, I'm sorry, sir. I was referring to you as OMB, sir. That Gordon England at OMB would have been able to get his hands on under sequester. Lots of pressure on the parties to move these things forward. You will notice from an industry perspective that the stocks, for the most part, are trading at a 52-week high. Have you noticed that? Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop. The market's betting against sequester. We know that we're going to get out of it, right? But the 2014, 15, 16 drawdown is going to continue. Last point, investor perspectives. Any investors? Yes, sir. What organization, sir? A shameless plug for you. I'm going to hang out with you, sir. You've got excess money. The president's going to want to talk to you, sir. Can you slew the camera over on him? We got a bill coming your way, sir.
Acquired target.
All right, let me quickly wrap up. But basically, when you talk to the investment market, right, what they're going to fundamentally tell you, and this is my kind of, they're very cagey and reclusive, but my kind of sense, right, this is why the stocks are trading at a 52-week high, right? We're going to see a deal, correct? Well, that's what they think. The cuts are probably going to be, it's going to be a negotiated compromise. I agree with Gordon, it's going to be a nail-biter right to the very end. I would tell you to expect cuts to the $525 billion 2013 base budget of about a $15 to $20 billion cut. And what's that mean to you? That's probably about, of the base budget, about 3%, 4%. That's what you should expect. The market is betting, as a general rule of thumb, on a worst case of about a $26, $27 billion sequester compromise, which is about a 5% cut. Okay? Last point. We've covered OSD, services, CEOs, investors, and I just want to close on one last point. The whole process of sequester, it's taxes, entitlements, the fiscal cliff, so on and so forth. It's very volatile, it's very emotional, it's inflammatory, and it's fundamentally stopping us from beginning the healing process after the election. I was just up in New York for most of last week, and I was astounded that of the 400 people that were there with me for 2 days, not one asked me how our 68,000 soldiers and Marines are doing in Afghanistan. This thing is sucking the oxygen out of the room. The faster we can get this behind us, whatever the deal is, the better off we're going to be. Thank you.
I'm going to sit and not be quite so funny as Jim, but I want to start off by thanking Admiral Daly and the Naval Institute for inviting me here. It's a privilege. There's a lot of senior folks I see in the room that could easily be sitting here as well. I know we're all very interested. I want to thank the folks in uniform for their service. I also want to thank Secretary Lynn for jumping back in the game. I always think it's a good thing that folks move in and out of industry into the Defense Department and the federal government at large, and we should just continue to encourage that. So look, on the industry side, which is what I'm going to try and focus on, as Nora said, the fiscal cliff is much bigger than sequestration. So in the long run, companies are looking at things like international tax rates, corporate tax rates, R&D credit, stuff like that. To the extent personal taxes affect the economic output and input at large, then of course companies outside of defense will have an effect. But today, that's not going to happen. Sequestration is what I think all the defense companies are really focused on for the next couple of weeks. So as Gordon said, there will be cuts and there will be job losses, and the fact of the matter is there have been job losses. Defense side of our company, well over 1,000 over the last couple of years. We got another 350 that are wrapped up in sequestration, depending on how that shakes out. Another company made an announcement just a couple days ago, more job losses. So it's happening. Companies are see it, and it'll happen much more substantially depending on how this plays out over the next month or so. I think the difference this time around, as Secretary Lynn and others pointed out, we've done this before every 20 years or so. The difference this time around is that word uncertainty. It is the abruptness with which the current cuts are planned, and just the general timing. As you look at it, those drawdowns were over a number of years. We got a fairly substantial, what looks like to be, I would say, 15% in procurement coming in right away if sequestration occurs as structured. So that uncertainty is really what companies are all wrapped up in right now. And so what are they doing? Well, we're cutting people. We're trying to stay ahead of that. We're looking at our facility. We're looking at our production, make sure we're operating at maximum capacity to the extent we can move production lines around. We can't do much further in those areas until we see what the cuts are actually going to be and in what programs they're going to occur. So the capital sits on the sidelines. We can't be as lean as we know we're going to need to be, but folks are trying to stay as much on top of it and be proactive as much as possible. And what is complicating the uncertainty in the planning process is the fact that right now we're under this CR, which is FY12 money, and you sequester a cut based on that. The programs that were planned to ramp up, like the tanker, are not going to ramp up. The money is basically in the wrong places for the wrong programs. So how that all plays out just adds more uncertainty to this whole game, if you will. So in tough times, what do companies do? You hunker down, you focus on your core markets, you exit the defense industry, you move into other markets, the commercial, our company, a little unique. We're right now close to 50-50 commercial and defense. So we've got the ability to take our R&D investments, for example, and throw them on a commercial side where things are growing for us about 7% a year, and we can take advantage of those kinds of things. Other companies are going to consolidate, they're going to acquire, they're going to move into cybersecurity, medical devices, things like that. So at the high level, at the prime level, you can do those kinds of things, and you can do them fairly effectively. There are some large defense companies that move very well into cyber, for example. But when you get down into the supply chain, we're a typical second-tier company. We do prime a few programs, but mostly we're on the second tier. And then you go into our supply base, the third, fourth tiers down. These companies tend to be fairly small. A lot of them tend to be commercial, and they don't have the capital or the equity to move in and out of businesses the way the larger companies do. So that, in my view, is where your great impact into the business side, the industrial base, is going to occur. And I commend Deputy Secretary Lambert for doing his analysis of the tiers. I think it needs to go deeper. But I think we will lose some technologies in those areas down in the supply chain. And I know the Deputy Secretary knows that well. So Three things I want to wrap up with real quickly. One is the practical issues and this whole notion of a ramp versus a cliff. You know, it's almost like we're trying to talk ourselves into, this isn't going to be so bad, it's going to be a ramp, it's not really a cliff. Well, if your ramp is 2 to 3 months, okay, I guess it's a ramp. But the fact of the matter is, you know, there will be job losses by the spring when these cuts occur. Contracting officers in the DOD are already slowing things down. Nobody's going to get ahead of their funding until they see how this thing plays out. And when that happens, if we don't have a place to move our engineers, those engineers are off the books because we've got to respond to our investors. We've got shareholders we're responsible for, and that's just the way business works. So 2 to 3 months, ramp, cliff, you know, take your choice of words, but the job losses are coming. And it's not like, you know, on the bigger issues, your tax rate changes, you know, okay, you're going to have to tighten up and things like that. You know, these are job losses. The second thing I'd just like to say is, you know, what can Congress do to help? I mean, I'm sure we're going to get into it, but look, the bigger the plan, the better. You know, we're talking about $1.2 trillion in cuts. That's 1 year out of 10 years. We're running $1 trillion a year. You know, the entitlement programs and the interest on the debt is 2/3 of the budget, and that's where the big money is. It's just like the JSF. When you cut defense, you go after the big programs, the carrier, the JFS, where the money is. I mean, the money in the federal budget is in the entitlement programs. I personally think people recognize that and know that folks that are 21 today are going to live longer than folks that are 75 today. You know, it's just the way things change, and folks are willing to accept that there were some overpromises made in the past and programs need to change. And I think that's where the tough political issues are, but need to get addressed, and it's not going to get addressed over the next couple of weeks, in my view. The last thing I would say is that defense has already paid close to $500 billion. So we're going to go at this again, and we're going to have to revise this strategy again, because the current strategy is based on the current funding, right? And like Gordon says, at some point, you got to start talking about doing less with less. We can't keep deploying these kids 5, 6 times onshore, back 2, 3 months, and back out again. And while those wars are drawing down, you know, you don't have to look far to see what's going on with Assad in the Middle East, to see what China's doing in the South Pacific Sea, to see what the terrorist groups continue to do. I mean, the world is a much more scary place than it was at the end of World War II, where everybody sees the future, everybody's calmed down, there's not a lot going on, or Vietnam. It's a very different dynamic in terms of national security. Nora?
Thanks very much. We'll now open it to your questions.
My name. I'd like to follow on to question whether or not we've taken into account how different the situation is right now. I raise my hand and say we're going over the fiscal cliff. I don't think it's going to happen in 2013. But with the entitlements that are, as of right now, unabated, and with the other side of the spending equation not being just taxing, which was limiting somebody's freedom at one point, but now creating a new security risk, which is the debt itself. You don't have to go too far back into history to look at the Suez Canal crisis, when the troops were landed in Suez Canal, and Eisenhower called up Anthony Eden and said, you got, I don't think he used these words, but said, you are at GDP to debt ratio, or debt to GDP ratio of about 200%. We won't roll over your, you won't roll over your debt unless you pull out. They pulled out. So we've got a whole new equation here, and we will be, in my view, bumping up against the debt capacity of the United States for the next 30 years. And if you believe the long-term projections of CBO, which could change, hopefully, if we bend the cost curves, for the rest of the century. How do you respond to that? How does this change, or how should this change our view of managing these issues? This is, in my, I graduated 50 years ago from the Naval Academy. This is unprecedented. Unprecedented. Thank you.
Everybody may be able to take a shot at that. One of the interesting things about the question that you raised, and I think it's critical, is 10 years ago, you never would have raised that question in this discussion. Which reinforces my point that the real terrain of discussion here is not about defense per se. The real terrain of discussion is what is our fiscal future as a nation? What is our economic future as a nation? And I think that's an entirely legitimate area of inquiry, and a totally appropriate area of questions for us to be talked about. Yesterday, a group of about 10 or 15 former national leaders of various kinds, mostly in the national security field, did a press conference on the subject that Pete Peterson had funded, basically saying, you were there, right? And you know, I read their statement, and you know, what they were saying, it was interesting to me, the entire statement was devoted to your set of issues. It was not devoted to what are the impacts on defense and what the industry is going to do and so on and so forth. Those are all real issues. But the fundamental issues are in that basket. You know, what do we as a nation do? And the debt to GDP ratio is what has been driving every analytical group that's been working on this issue. And we did the defense options for Diminish-Rivlin, for example. The whole Diminish-Rivlin case was about how do we get to a point 10 years out when debt is stabilized at 60% of GDP. That's the target. What do we need to do to get there? If you set that as a target, A, and you determine, B, everybody has to come to the party or you can't get the budget deal or the political deal by doing it, that's where you get the waterfall effect down on why defense is both residual but on the table. You know, that it's part of that discussion. And Noah's right, it's a small part of that overall discussion, but you can't get home on a deal unless everything is on the table. What's interesting to me is CBO did this analysis earlier this year, looking at what are the sources of the more than doubling of our debt over the past 10 years, you know, 01 to 10. What are the sources of that? If you start with baseline current law 2001, what explains more than doubling our debt between that baseline and today? And the answer, you know, I don't think anybody disagrees that entitlements are a big problem here, but they're not the only problem here. The biggest sources, over 40%, were the combination of the tax cuts of 2001 and the recession of 2008, 9, 10, which combined explain over 40% of the more than doubling of our debt as a share of GDP. The second biggest element after revenues was the doubling of defense budget authority, concluding the cost of the war, over the same period of 10 years. Changes in current law in the area of entitlements were a minimal contributor to the doubling of that debt. Right? It's another way of looking at the numbers. I'm not here saying, you know, defense is the big part of the debt problem. That's not right. It's also not right to say the big part of the debt problem is just the entitlement programs, because baseline to baseline, that's not what explains more than doubling our debt. And it's another reason that all of these issues have to be on the table.
You're looking at me pensively.
I'm trying to figure out whether you want to...
Waiting for a moment of brilliance. Just, I can't even work this thing, sir. I would just tell you 2 points. As best I can remember, and I defer to my esteemed colleagues, the CBO projections, and they had done one in May, and they had done the update in November. So of the fiscal cliff, probably about, the whole creature was what, about 600 billion, right? Of which taxes is probably about 2/3 of that in the short term. Sequester being about half of that remaining 1/3. So the compromise will have to occur on taxes, number one. It is what it is. Number two, I don't necessarily know that in the short term the debt ceiling crisis is a negative thing in the short term. Long-term problem, yes, because that really seems to be where the House is most effective in terms of trying to get at the entitlement problems. The House generally seems to wait for the debt ceiling crisis, right? And then they generally tend to make that up with the entitlement cuts that you're really fundamentally talking about. This is why I was saying I think we will see a short-term deal, right? We're not driving the train at the fence, and that's why I think that deal is going to happen probably at the end of February, if not March, because the tax rates have to lapse first, and then the deal, I think, is going to happen when we do the debt ceiling probably in mid to late February.
I would just add, I do think the issue is all about the fiscal solvency of the nation, if you will. So it's huge, and defense gets wrapped up in that discussion. I think so it's going to get cut some more, in all likelihood, even though you could argue otherwise. But what I do think people need to start thinking about is, when that occurs, you should also be trying to find ways to help stabilize, preserve the industrial base and capabilities you want. So the bigger the plan, the better. It makes for better planning all around from a company's perspective. Things like international tax competitiveness, corporate tax rates, export control reform, research and development tax credit, all those things will become increasingly important, just like the commercial supply base. I think Bruce, our engineer, pointed out earlier, most of the supply base for a company like ours, take GPS. That supply base is basically all commercial companies. Electronics, same kind of thing. So, our company was not alone when the tsunami hit Japan. We're tracking dozens of companies in Japan who are suppliers to us, as are a number of companies in this room, because it is a global supply base. And so you're going to have to support policies like commercial contracting that helps keep those suppliers in the game and not force them out. So, I think there's these second, third level, effects that people need to start focusing on and help solve.
I got to move on because the panel ends in 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Oh. Question in the back?
Robbie Harris, a former naval person. Dr. Adams commented a few minutes ago that during the drawdown of the 90s, when O&M went down, that we actually spent the O&M money more wisely. I think it's also true that during the 90s, with the drawdown, that readiness suffered and suffered significantly. During the drawdown in the 70s, the forces are said to have hollowed out. We certainly did not hollow out in the 90s, but readiness did suffer. Secretary Panetta has said we will not hollow out under this drawdown. What level of confidence do you have and the other members of the panel that we will not have a readiness decline with this drawdown? Thank you.
Let me talk to that, because some of that gets a little bit technical, but we did 3 drawdowns since setting aside the end of the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the drawdown of the 1990s. In every one of those instances, the primary contributor on the in-strength side was the ground force. The ground forces were the ones that went down. Interestingly, in the last 10 years, the Navy and the Air Force both shrank a little bit while the ground force was building up. That's all perfectly normal. So you take down the ground force. I'd say the most disruptive of those 3 build downs was the 70s. Because not only were we drawing down the ground force, it was a conscript ground force, and we were transitioning to a professional military, which meant incredible turbulence through the 1970s and a hollowing out that was noticeable in the 1970s. In the 50s, we drew down the ground force, and Eisenhower deliberately made a strategic decision that we were going to rely on massive retaliation in the nuclear forces to deter the Soviet Union, so it was okay to draw down the ground forces. And he turned around and he told the ground force people, and oddly enough, he was a ground force person, this is where it's going to go. This is what it's going to be. And I'm willing to take that risk on the ground force side and the Fulda Gap in exchange for, if the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact come through, the nuclear response is the response that they're going to look at. So there was a strategic change. In the 70s, the strategic change was going to 1.5 wars in partnership in other countries. So there was a doctrinal change in the way that the military was going to be engaged. In the 90s, the change really, most of the drawdown in the 90s, which people don't focus on as much, was done under the leadership of George H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Colin Powell. And Powell developed the doctrine that surrounded the base force to focus on 2 MRCs as the planning algorithm for force planning in the Department of Defense, which was sensible. It was smart. And from his point of view, it was a way of avoiding what he called a free fall in defense. The readiness issue as a consequence of that is the technical piece, because I was there for that, and I remember in 1994 we threw an extra $24 billion on the plate in defense, mostly for political reasons, because the reality of readiness in the units was nowhere near as bad as it was being portrayed. But like many things in Washington, this was caught in a political battle. So the Republican Party in this 94 elections were accusing the administration of letting readiness fall, and the administration was throwing money supposedly at readiness in order to prevent that argument from being compelling in 94. That failed. The Republicans won both houses of the Congress. But it was more of a political argument than it was a readiness argument. The proof of the pudding in that was when George W. Bush decided he was going to invade Iraq, which, albeit with all kinds of weaknesses, was nonetheless the fifth largest army in the world. It was basically a speed bump in military terms. That is to say, a lot of work was in fact done in the Pentagon in the 1990s to protect readiness and capability in the forces. So I'm not saying there was no issue there, I'm saying it was a highly exaggerated issue in readiness terms. I think the Pentagon, and Panetta was after all the OMB director and the chief of staff for part of that process, is very much aware of how you draw wagons in a circle around the capabilities that you have in, air, sea, land in the military. Good planning is quite doable under the fiscal circumstances that we're talking about to protect that kind of readiness and that kind of capability.
Can I be very brief? Please. Sir, I cannot guarantee you that readiness will not suffer in the future. The O&M generally tends to remain flat, if not actually grows, during past drawdowns. I can tell you my personal observations when I look inside the O&M accounts, right, separate from the investment accounts. I can tell you that my personal observation is General Odierno is from the Army, specifically taking funding out of the OCL O&M. The Army's got almost about $80 billion combined O&M bucket. And he specifically is driving that into the base budget. It's very visible in 2013. And he's particularly putting it at the pointy end of the spear, which is the bucket that we refer to as the operating forces account for the Army. For Admiral Greenert, I would tend to generally watch his metrics of ship operations and also air operations. I mean, you guys do the budget right here, so you know better than I. Ship ops, all told, about $13 billion. Air ops, off the top of my head, sir, about $10 billion. All visible indications, just off the top of my head, sir, is the air ops has remained flat, which is positive, and the ship ops money has actually gone up, which is a positive indicator. Air Force will be the place where you want to watch the challenge. Okay? Total Navy O&M budget about $47 billion, same size with the Air Force. The Air Force has got the one that's got the growing O&M problem. Okay? That's beginning to eat up the modernization accounts. And they've got two big buckets you want to watch going forward. One is the Air Ops account, which feeds Air Combat Command, right? And the second one will be the Mobilization O&M account to watch going forward, which feeds Air Mobility Command out at Scott Air Force Base. But all current indications that I can see looking at the budget for 2013, because remember my visibility is very limited with O&M, is positive at this time.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I certainly don't want to be the person who stands between you and coffee. So please join me in thanking the panel for a really interesting discussion this morning.
Thanks, Jim.
It was great.
Let me, on behalf of the Naval Institute, thank Dr. Benzahill and the panel for an absolutely splendid presentation. We have a gift of the Naval Institute press book, In the Shadow of Greatness, for each of you. We'll break now for 15 minutes. The next panel will be at 11 o'clock. Thank you.